Okay, so there's basically 3 stages to making wine, and each one has a specific goal. But more importantly, I guess when you're starting out with winemaking, is to understand what the goal of each is so we can move to the next step at the right time. Okay, for step number 1, we have primary fermentation. And that is quite simply just a big plastic pail. Often it's just a 5-gallon pail. Sometimes they have markings on the side. There we go. I use a 5 or a 6-gallon pail for my 5-gallon carboys. But the goal of this is quite simply just to take our sugars and convert them to alcohol. That's it. That's what this is all about. Incorporating all our ingredients in our wines and getting that to all turn. Now we know that this is done once we have a specific gravity reading that doesn't change for 3 days. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind for primary fermentation is if we have fruit in here, I wouldn't let it sit in here for more than 7 days. Probably even 6 is enough once the fermentation has started. You want to get that fruit bag out of there because it's going to end up doing things we don't want it to do, specifically giving it bad flavors. Fruit is already broken down pretty good. We've got what we need from it. It needs to get out of there. So once we have our specific gravity down and reading the same thing for 3 days, you're going to need a hydrometer to do that. It's going to go into secondary fermentation. Now, most often for secondary fermentation, we just have our big glass carboys. You can do this with a 1 gallon or whatever size that works best for you, or whatever size batch you're making, or if they make them in 3 gallons, they probably make them in every gallon. I typically go with the larger size. It leaves more room for error. A small error in 5 gallons of wine is going to be a lot less noticeable than it is in a 1 gallon batch. But that being said, if you make a 5 gallon batch and you do it wrong, you've just made 5 gallons of bad wine. Anyway, the goal of secondary fermentation is just to take and clarify. I don't know why they call it secondary. There should be almost no yeast activity going in here. You're still going to see some bubbles in your bubbler in secondary, but the goal of this stage is to clarify. Now, when we went from primary to secondary, we left a lot of sediment and stuff behind in our pails if we did this correctly. And that's called groslies. And if you pronounce it really bad for the French, groslies, they will make your wine taste gross. So leave those behind. These are fine, and the lees that are left in your secondary are fine. And they're fine to leave, I guess. Messing up the French here completely. But they will add flavor, complexity, and dynamic to your wine. So they're okay to be in here, and your wine can be with them for quite a while without having any negative effects. So in here, we can be patient. We can just let it sit. Wine will clarify all on its own given enough time. All the yeast that's left in here and kind of floating throughout the wine solution or the mix will eventually finish doing what it's doing, and it'll settle right to the bottom. And that is the goal of secondary. Now, just because we have one secondary doesn't mean it's just going to stay in here. We're probably going to rack it from here to another glass carboy of the same size, again leaving behind any sediment, and that is the job of secondary. That's really it. It is to clarify the wine. Now, you can speed this up using bentonite, and there's other clarifying agents. The 2-part solutions are probably the most effective and most dramatic I've seen. But I'm told, and I haven't done it for myself, used a method where I'm patient enough to just let it settle out on its own. But apparently wine will all clear all on its own, and there's nothing you actually have to do as far as adding clarifiers here to get it clear. Anyway, that's step 2 or stage 2. Once we have our wine clear, totally clarified, that's the part where we all like. So when we get to take it and put it into bottles, now the goal of stage 3 is 2 things. Not only is this a great storage container, it also, we can pop these things open and we can enjoy the fruits of our labor. This is the apple, correction, this is just a plum wine that I made. and it is really coming into its own. I'm quite happy about this one. Anyway, that's that's a little bit of a side rant. There is nothing wrong with taking, and if you have a completely clear wine in a carboy with very little head space, so your wine comes up almost to the top, you can age it in here just fine. There's nothing wrong with that. However, if we're winemakers, we probably want this carboy for another batch of wine to cook something else in. So bottling it, putting it into a rack, and giving it time to age is a good thing too. Now, the goal of aging the wine is just to let chemistry and whatever magic all happens in that bottle, let it happen. There's different things that are still happening, even though the fermentation is long done inside of our wine bottle, that is still making the tannins mellow into the wine and making all the flavors just kind of meld and come together and smooth out that wine. There's a lot to be said for giving a wine time to age. This one is a great example, actually, of that. This plum wine was really tart. It's kind of like eating a choke cherry, where you just really dried your palate and had like a really sharp pucker factor to it, like a tea maybe. It's a good way to say it. Anyway, after this one has sat now for about 10 months, 9 months, somewhere around there, it is really coming into its own, and I'm really enjoying this wine. It is still dry, and it still does leave a bit of a dry pucker on the mouthfeel, but I'm loving it. I'm really loving this wine. I absolutely enjoy sipping this wine in the evening. This one's a little bit too much pucker for the wife. It's probably, this wine would be more suited to somebody that kind of likes like gooseberries in spring. I'm not a sommelier by any means, and I don't even try to pretend that I am one. I'm just trying to give you layman's terms on how to describe what we've come up with. Anyway, that is the 3 stages of making wines. I hope I've answered some questions for people that are getting into winemaking. Those are some of the questions that I had that I just never really understood, primary and secondary. I understood the difference or why we stuck it in a bottle, the whole aging thing, but I did not understand why, when primary, when secondary, and what our goal was to leave behind to make the transition to a final good finished product. Hopefully that helps. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below, and we'll see you again when I'm making the next vid.